This was Newport's golden age of trade, and Lopez was Newport's most successful merchant. His family takes credit for building Newport's famed Touro synagogue, and for introducing the sperm oil industry to America. Before his ships went to Africa in search of black slaves, his fleet plied the oceans hunting for whales. A collection of his papers, including ship's manifests, receipt books, and various records, fills 147 volumes, and is preserved today. Rhode Island has been called an American Venice, a tiny area unsuitable for farming, but by nature a trading mecca. The state's industry would benefit from the slave trade in other ways. It may have been a center of the rum business, with 30 rum distilleries depending on the triangular trade that depended on African slaves. The rum, sugar, and slave businesses all evolved around each other, which kept Rhode Island prominent in the slave trade. Author J. Cautry in his book The Notorious Triangle estimates that 100,000 Africans were taken aboard more than 900 ships registered to Rhode Island owners. Many families descended from slave traders would later destroy family documents and alter others, to absolve the family from guilt. Their wealth and power were never diluted, and many prominent 212 from the sacred to the profane names, built their fame on the triangle trade. Traders included the Wanton family, whose Joseph Wanton would be remembered as the 4th governor of Rhode Island, Abraham Redwood, benefactor of the Redwood Library, John Bannister, owner of Bannister's Wharf, Samuel and William Vernon, Philip Wilkinson, and Stephen Derault. One family that was extremely wealthy, and prominent because of the trade, and could not erase the past was the De Wolfs. They came to Rhode Island through the Caribbean. Mark Antoine De Wolf, whose migration started in Portugal and proceeded to Holland, Guadeloupe, and finally Bristol, Rhode Island, married the English immigrant Abigail Potter. Bristol was the namesake of England's largest slave port, and the De Wolf was introduced to the trade as a captain on the ship of his brother-in-law, Simeon Potter. Potter traded slaves and rum in the Caribbean, and De Wolf learned quickly. With his 8 sons following De Wolf into the slave business, his extended family may have been responsible for a quarter of Rhode Island's slaving expeditions. Not everyone in his family was happy with the business, however. His youngest son, Levi, was so disgusted after one slaving voyage, that he resigned from the family firm. But others showed no signs of dissension. One of Levi's brothers was famous for throwing a slave who had smallpox into the ocean. Rhode Island had attempted to stop the trade, and took several actions against the De Wolf and Brown clans. When a slave ship was confiscated, the slavers united to help the owner, to buy it at rigged auction. When the government sent agents to correct the abuses, they were hauled away or beaten. When the federal government sent a special prosecutor, John Leonard, to try a slave trade case against James De Wolf, a Rhode Island jury failed to convict the trader. Winning the case was not enough, though, and De Wolf sent his own agents to Washington, D.C., to deliver a message. They beat Leonard on the courthouse steps. The Bristol and Newport trade went on long after it was illegal. James De Wolf quit in 1808, but his brother George continued until master masons, and their slaves 213 1820, 12 years after the national ban. James married the daughter of William Bradford, who owned a rum distillery and served in the United States Senate. He put his slave trade profits into textile mills, and became owner of the Arkwright Manufacturing Company, which survived into modern times, and is currently part of a Dutch company. The De Wolf family would also be remembered for founding one of the first New England insurance firms. The firm insured both the slave ships and the cargo. Today the De Wolf's imposing mansion, Linden Place in Bristol, is a tourist attraction. It was built in 1810 by General George De Wolf, who moved his headquarters to Cuba, and continued growing his fortune in plantations, the slave trade, and West Indian piracy. In 1825, when the sugar crop failed in Cuba, George abandoned his mansion and skipped out of Rhode Island ahead of his creditors. The family home changed hands several times, but each time to a different De Wolf. Theodore De Wolf married Christopher Colt, the brother of the famous handgun manufacturer, and had 6 children with him. After Theodore's death, Samuel Colt bought out his brother's interest and remained in the house. Samuel Colt is also credited with founding the Industrial Trust Company, which merged with Fleet National Bank, now called Fleet Boston Financial, one of the largest banks in New England. Samuel B. Colt, Samuel Colt's nephew and Theodora's son, became a prosperous lawyer in New England, and handled the Vanderbilt estate. He is also remembered for merging small rubber companies, to create United States Rubber, which later became Uni Royal. Rhode Island remained a closed society long after the slave trade was history. Membership in a Masonic lodge appears to have been a requirement for political office in the state. Governors David Russell Brown, Norman Case, Robert Livingston Beekman, William Gregory, Charles Kimball, Herbert Warren Ladd, and Frank Licht were all Masons, as were and are numerous Rhode Island senators, congressmen, and other office holders. 214 from the sacred to the profane patriots and prophets. It is often said that New England was the core of the Revolution. Those hurt by the restrictive trade covenants of the mother country were the merchants and traders. The early stages of rebellion are traced to the Stamp Act and other mercantile edicts. In 1764, when Britain tried to raise the price of sugar and molasses, the merchants and ship owners of Massachusetts banded together to oppose the action. Such commodities were essential to the slave trade, which was vital to New England commerce. Colonial shipping employed 4,000 seamen in New England, and was responsible for thousands of peripheral occupations. The Cabot and Russell families of Boston were two of the largest shippers. George Cabot was an Anglophile and a staunch Federalist whose family wealth was built on merchant shipping. He served as a senator from Massachusetts, and was appointed the first Secretary of the Navy, but declined the post. Although many of those who sought independence for the colonies were made wealthy through the slave trade, others were opposed to it. The success of the Revolution may have depended on the money and connections of the merchants, but its ideals were not dependent on the merchants whose politics would carefully straddle the proverbial fence until a decision was forced. New York in the trade. The numbers of slave ships sailing from New York was small compared to those of the New England states, but the wealth of the New Yorkers who prospered through the trade is at least as great. The trade was restricted to the elite families that had often been among the feudal overlords from the colony's earliest days. The intermarried elite corps that brought the Scottish Livingston family together with their Dutch neighbours the Schuylers was joined by the Phillipses, Thomas Francis Lewis, the Beekmans, the Marstons, the Van Holmes, the Van Cortlands, and the Walters. Until the American Revolution, the wealth of the Master Masons and their slaves 215 Phillips family might have put them among the top 10 in the colonies. Frederick Phillips had arrived with Peter Stuyvesant as a master builder for the West India Company. Phillips exploited the valuations of native wampum, bought land, and invested in trade from the beginning. His backing of pirate voyages may have been among his greatest ventures, and he would even marry the widow of another transatlantic trader. Phillips's slave trade was just one part of his vast operation. By 1693 the Phillips lands stretched 21 miles along the Hudson, for a total of 92,000 acres. Philip Phillips, an heir to Frederick's fortune, married Margaret Marston, thus linking another powerful family to his own. The Marstons owned land on Wall Street as well as the huge Prospect Farm, a country estate near what is now 85th Street. The Marstons too were a mercantile family, and as slave traders they would keep slaves on their Manhattan estate. Margaret's father, Nathaniel, was active in the Anglican Church, and is buried in the family vault in Trinity Church, a Manhattan landmark. His portrait in the Museum of the City of New York depicts him with his ledger book, a reference to his participation in the China trade. Although the volume of ships owned by New Yorkers was less than that of New Englanders,